Hello, gathered friends. I'm Hrora Nuva, and welcome to Bionicle Deep Dive, where we analyze the tropes, characters, and lore of LEGO Bionicle. Ask any Bionicle fan what made the series so captivating, and chances are one of the things they'll bring up is how incredibly unique and atmospheric it was, and how the whole series was positively dripping with mystery and wonder. In this video, I want to explore what made Bionicle's atmosphere so unique by identifying and analyzing what I believe to be the four core themes of its aesthetic and world building: the biological, the mechanical, the natural, and the mystical. And I'll explain what I mean by these in just a moment. These elements of Bionicle's world building are deeply ingrained in the story's aesthetic and themes at all levels, particularly in stories set in and around the Matorn universe, as these themes all connect to the reveal of Matanui's true nature. Bionicle truly is a series that pushes the boundaries of the distinction between sci-fi and fantasy, and the fascinating ways these contrasting motifs intertwine with each other is part of what creates a universe that truly feels like no other. Let's dive right into it. First, the biological. The biological is the theme of life and living things. It manifests in the story in two ways. The first is in how the characters are all biomechanical and are as much organism as machine. It's an aspect of them that brings them to life and separates them from the purely robotic creatures, making them somehow both more relatable and more alien at the same time. The second and more significant way this theme manifests is how the world they live in is the body of the Great Spirit Matanui. Every aspect of their world, and even themselves, are in fact a piece of his biology. This is, after all, the biological chronicle. It's the most subtle of the four motifs at first, given how intrinsically tied it is to the big reveal. But despite being hidden early on, it is still nonetheless deeply prevalent and shaped how the creators designed the world. Each location, particularly inside the Matorn universe, functioned as an organ to Matanui. The city of Metrunui formed his brain, with the suns overhead being his eyes. The cavern of Cardanui was his heart, and the various distant island chains followed the path of his limbs. Even the island of Matanui itself is his face. In Mask of Light, when they pass through the doorway that leads to Metrunui, you can see organic details in the walls around them, hinting at the true nature of the world they return to. The world being an organism is central to the plot, as so much of the Toa's quest is about healing Matanui and saving his life. The biological also comes heavily to the forefront in the second half of the story, with the introduction of the Knowi Ignika, the legendary Mask of Life. With the Ignika comes many stories about life and mutation and biology, along with questions of what it truly means to be alive, questions that we ourselves inherently ask when looking at these seemingly mechanical yet deeply living creatures. As many of you may know, the biological aspect of the story has its origins from Christian Favor, one of the original creators and concept artists of Bionicle. Back then, he was receiving treatment for a tumor, and would imagine the pills he was taking were carrying tiny warriors that would go into his body and fight the disease. This became the inspiration for the Toa canners that the heroes arrived in, and that the sets came packaged in. The Toa were not just warriors, or even just heroes, they were medicine. The Matorn in turn were the Great Spirit's worker cells, keeping his body functioning, and the whole story is a poignant metaphor for keeping health from the perspective of the inhabitants of the body. Moving on to the next thematic core, the mechanical, is the theme of technology, machines, and robots. It's probably the most obvious of the four, given the robotic nature of the characters, though the depth to which this theme integrates itself into the story is no less impressive. Especially in the early years on Matanui, the mechanical theme stood out so much because, well, it stood out. The setting was largely a wild island with small rural villages with a strong culture of mysticism. In our usual storytelling culture, all of these things are associated with low-tech fantasy, and yet every person and animal on the island is a cyborg. And in many ways, it's jarring because the characters themselves are by far the most advanced technology in the setting. Everything they actually use is at most early industrial level tech. This ends up foreshadowing how little they know of their own origins, because it's obvious they don't have the technology to invent themselves. Eventually, we see the flashback years in Metro Nui, and the high-tech, futuristic-looking city fits much more closely to where we would imagine these cyborgs would live. But even still, Metro Nui is clearly ancient and sometimes anachronistic. Mechanical also plays a large role in the world as a whole, as the Matoran universe itself is as much a machine as it is a body. Each place serves a function, and the world itself is a robot with a mission. And yet, despite this obvious artificial nature, the story and its characters never question that they are people, and that their world matters, bringing implied questions of what it means to be real, and where the line between person and machine truly is. A theme that Greg Farsty hinted was going to be explored later on with the introduction of the fully natural Agori and Glutorian, and how the two cultures would interact with each other. And what makes it so interesting is that these questions of what it means to be a person were implied. While deeply ingrained, they aren't central to the plot, giving a subtlety to the atmosphere that really draws people in. The next theme is the natural, the theme of nature, the environment, and the physical world around the characters. One of the biggest atmospheric draws to Bionicle has always been the beautiful and creative landscapes of the setting. Honestly, in addition to the plot, sometimes the best way to experience the story is just to sit back and enjoy the gorgeous artwork of the pristine natural locations on Motunui. It's part of what made the Motunui online game so fun, because it felt like a big nature tour of the island. Like the biological, the natural is deeply ingrained with life, but while the biological deals with living things on the level of the organism, the natural deals with life on the level of the ecosystem. And as such, perhaps one of the biggest and most meaningful ways the natural comes up in the themes of Bionicle are in the environmental messages of the story. Exploring environmentalist messages in Bionicle warrants a video to itself, but I'll give a brush over here in how it pertains to the topic. Maintaining the balance of the natural world around them is a major part of the Toa's mission. Healing the Great Spirit intrinsically means healing the world. Even inside the Matoran universe, where the world is distinctly artificial and there's much more urban and mechanical landscapes, the natural still comes into play, as there are still complex ecosystems filled with complex rahi and wonderful locales. The whole world is a robotic body, so the natural landscape is intrinsically intertwined with both the biological and the mechanical. It's an alien nature, but still very much nature to the characters and the setting, and the importance of maintaining and respecting it is given high narrative weight. Efforts to keep nature balanced come up again and again. The Makuta were originally meant to create and maintain the wild Rahi of the MU, and later on the Rahaga made it their mission to protect and preserve the Rahi, to protect the ecosystems and keep them in balance. The Borak saga was filled with environmental themes, as the destruction they wrought was framed as an environmental disaster, with the displacement of the people and creatures of Motunui being in the forefront of the narrative. This theme of environmentalism was so important for the story to have. In real life, we humans need to learn respect for the balance of nature, and to fight to keep our world in balance. Preserving Earth's natural environment is extremely necessary to save ourselves and everyone from the short-sighted greed of those who seek to exploit the planet for their own wealth and power. Now, the final core theme is the mystical, the theme of magic and spiritualism that permeates the whole story. Bionicle feels like a classical mythological fantasy adventure more than sci-fi at times, especially in the early arcs. This mysticism comes in the form of not only literal magic, but in the culture of the Matoran that surrounds their ideas of magic and spiritualism. They have a very clear mythological way of looking at the universe around them, describing the Toa, Makuta, and Motunui as spirits whose conflict shapes the cosmos. Especially in some of the early material, the Matoran honor the Toa in ways that make them out to be like deities, taking care to preserve nature in their elemental domains so as not to displease them. There was a deep storytelling culture among the Matoran, where they told and retold legends and prophecies, much like human societies do with regards to our own mystical beliefs. They also have a strong belief in destiny and fate, as well as an astrological system that's used to make prophecies of the future. And these prophecies are shown to be fairly grounded, as on Metru Nui, the stars in the sky above the city were actually the lights on the inside of the Great Spirit Robot's head. They were literally observing Matanui's thoughts. They were also spiritual in a moral way. The Matoran revealed the Great Spirit in large part for giving them the three virtues, and went even further to derive principles beyond them. The struggles against Makuta are framed as a battle between light and dark, good and evil, creation and destruction. And in the end, it is the Toa's faith in their virtues that allows them to become heroes and overcome any obstacle. So those are what I believe to be the core themes that Bionicle's atmosphere was built out of. Each of these four motifs is a component of the world building that is present from the beginning, and intentionally so, as they are all pieces that hint to the true nature of the Matoran universe, which was planned right at the start. But because the mystery of the reveal needed to be preserved, we were only given whatever pieces of these motifs the story theme could show without giving it all away. As such, at the beginning of the story, we are given these motifs, but we don't understand the true significance of how they intertwine, even though it's obvious that they are woven together intentionally, as both every character and every location has some connection to all of these. This creates a world that is deeply alien and filled with inherent contradictions that intertwine and hint to a greater mystery. We see these motifs intertwine with each other in numerous times in fascinating ways across the story. The biological and the mechanical obviously intertwine with the characters themselves, as they are biomechanical. They're a blend of living creature and robotic machine. It makes them very unique and mysterious, yet also relatable at the same time, and they force us to wonder where the line between person and machine truly lies. They are undoubtedly people. The story never questions their emotions or the value of their lives, and yet they are also kinda alien. The biomechanical characters, in turn, are intertwined with the theme of the natural, as these cyborg beings integrate themselves so deeply with the natural environment. Particularly on the early arcs on the island of Matanui, the Matoran live in rural villages where they are heavily dependent on and coexist with their natural surroundings. This idea of technology and nature coming together harmoniously, rather than one being inherently opposed to the other, is such an important core message of Bionicle, and one that is radically different from the norms of most storytelling that we see. This aspect is another major influence of Christian Faber, who loves to explore the intertwining of technology, nature, and biology in his work. An avid environmental advocate, much of his work focuses on the theme of technology not being at odds with the environment, but rather that it can be used as a powerful tool in balancing our relationship with the Earth if we approach it with respect. This theme of a coexistence between technology and nature is a central theme in his project Rebel Nature. Now, the project is still very much in development, but from what I've seen, it seems to take place in a future where humans no longer seem dominant, and the remains of our technology has begun to combine itself with nature. Robots start acting as creatures who are a part of the environment in both good and bad ways, showing how life will always find a way, even beyond our control and understanding. Going back to how these themes play out in Bionicle, we really see how heavily the biological, mechanical, and natural are blended together when you consider how much of the plot is about healing the world. Saving the world is simultaneously healing the body, repairing the machine, and balancing nature. The comparison between balancing the ecosystem and healing the body in particular is a very profound one, and actually somewhat realistic, as microbiology shows that our own bodies are not simply our own cells, but a complex microscopic ecosystem of human cells, bacteria, viruses, and other tiny living things. Many illnesses are caused by an imbalance in this microecosystem within us, and healing is about restoring its balance. The idea of the biomechanical landscape is represented perhaps most elegantly in the series of Metru Nui concept arts by Christian Faber. While coming up with the look for the City of Legends, he made 3 very similar drawings of Metru Nui's skyline, each with its own theme. A very geological, natural geo version, with heavy emphasis on the land. a bio version that was very organic and emphasized the anatomical nature of the MU, showing various connective tissue between buildings and structures. And third, the tech version that showed extremely advanced futuristic technology and aesthetics. These three correspond nicely to the natural, biological, and mechanical themes I'm using, and in fact, this concept art was a major inspiration for the idea of this video. In the end, we got a bit of each in Metro Nui, and it shows just how much the core themes were on the minds of the creators. Another very subtle but really cool instance of blending biology and a natural landscape in the world building is the ice ring that surrounds the island of Voyanui. This was never explained in story, but on his site Faber Files, Christian Faber says that the concept behind an ice ring forming around Voyanui after it came to the surface was meant to be a system to preserve it outside the Great Spirit robot, referencing how organs that are removed from a body are put in coolers to keep them alive until they can be put back. Now, the intersection of themes goes even further when you add in the mystical aesthetics. Now, the natural intersects with the mystical in that much of the magic shown is essentially nature magic, with the Toa described as being the spirits of their elements. There's deep spiritual reverence for the elements, and such a reverence for the natural world the elements build. The mystical also interacts with the mechanical on two levels. The first is how much, though not all, of the things that were thought of as magical at the beginning of the story are revealed to be a case of sufficiently advanced technology being indistinguishable from magic, which is a core central theme of the story. The second level is how much destiny and prophecy can be described as machine purpose from a certain point of view. Or at least that's my interpretation. Destiny has a wide variety of interpretations throughout the fandom, many of which all have sufficient evidence for them. So many of the ancient prophecies of the Matoran were, for lack of a better term, the instruction manuals left behind by the great beings, and after thousands of years of being told and retold, morphed into legends. To the great beings, the Toamata were a fail-safe contingency plan in case the robot went offline and needed rebooting. But to the Matoran, they were prophesized saviors meant to return their guardian deity to them and restore balance to the universe. It's not that the Matoran didn't understand their true significance, they did. It's just that it's much more meaningful and spiritual from their point of view, as the Matoran were the ones who had to live through it. It's like both sides didn't have the full information. Perhaps it was the great beings who were truly in the dark, because while they knew the broader scope, they were blind to the deeply personal significance these fail-safes turned heroes would have. At the same time, Destiny and Bionicle cannot be described just as machine purpose. It's shown many times that Destiny acts as a truly cosmic force of nature outside of the designs of the great beings. So what we have is not the mystical just being the mechanical in disguise, but rather the mystical and the mechanical being truly intertwined, as the purpose of these machines follows the guiding path of destiny through all its twists and turns. So we see that these motifs aren't just present in the story by themselves, but constantly play off of each other, despite sometimes seeming contradictory on the surface. In storytelling in general, I find that one of the most engaging ways to create depth in both characters and worlds is to give them inherent contradictions that somehow fit together to form a whole. The need to resolve these contradictions creates both a mystery to solve and a conflict to drive the story forward. And as I mentioned before, these contradictions also serve to make the world very alien to us. This is because they really only contradictions from the perspective of our experience in the real world, which forces us to understand that this is a world that operates on very different rules from our own. And Bionicle masterfully communicates this all by doing it subtextually. These contradictions go unspoken, because in the world of the characters, they're treated as completely normal. They don't ever say, "Wow, it sure is weird that we're cyborgs living on a rural tropical island." It just shows us this incredibly unique combination of aesthetics and goes along with its plot about heroes saving the day. So all the time we're engaging with the plot, in the back of our minds, we're trying to understand what's happening beneath the surface. And that gets us true mystery lovers hooked on trying to figure out what are the underlying consistencies that make these contradictions connected. And it's so good, that was so engaging. And what makes all of these things really work is the fact that there is a singular through line that connects everything, a through line that was there from the beginning and makes it all cohesive. That underlying consistency, the point where all these thematic threads converge, is Matanui himself, who is the ultimate embodiment of all these things in Bionicle, which makes sense. These are all core components of their universe, and Matanui is their universe. Matanui is the body at the core of the biological. His health is the mission of the heroes. He is the machine at the core of the mechanical that they are all a part of, and that his maintenance and mission is what shapes their destiny. He is literally the natural landscape around them and influences nature even when they aren't inside him, as the island of Matanui is literally his face. And he is the great spirit at the head of the mysticism, a powerful cosmic entity to the Matoran who gives them purpose and keeps the universe in balance. All of these themes come together and they all hint to the greater mystery, the big story engine, as the writers called him, that was at the center of the story. In a post on Tumblr, Tired Space Dragon says that one of the most core and indispensable part of a good Bionicle story is the giant robot, because it's the glue that joins the scattered elements of the story together. While some, both among the fans and clearly the writers of G2 as well, may not include it, Tired Space Dragon says that the Great Spirit Robot is key to Bionicle's identity. And I wholeheartedly agree. The giant robot is intrinsically necessary because it drives the mystery and is what's so central to Bionicle's appeal. It's what ties everything together and makes it feel like a true world rather than disparate parts. Even if we didn't see it for the majority of the story before its reveal, its presence is felt in the world and the foreshadowing at all levels. And while Matanui is the embodiment and source of these core themes, Makuta Pterodax, the ultimate big bad of the series, represents corruption in all these themes. He is the embodiment of evil in decay in the world, and the dark brother of Matanui, and is a force of destruction against everything Matanui sought to create and preserve. In the biological, Makuta is a cancer to Matanui, literally a piece of himself that went rogue and threatens to kill him, an illness that must be healed. In the mechanical, he is a virus breaking down the machine, causing errors in the code, and his influence is shown by rusted and corroded metal. He's what sent the robot offline and caused it to crash. In the natural, he is a blight upon the land. His presence causes fields to wither away and sunlight to grow cold. He causes natural disasters and plagues to befall the Matoran, particularly on the island of Matanui, where he twisted his rule of the land, sea, and sky to torment them. He set the naturally peaceful Rahi creatures against them, his influence turning them into monstrous beasts. And his greatest crime, the Great Cataclysm, sent shockwaves and environmental devastation throughout the whole of the Matoran universe, ripping up entire islands and shattering the careful balance. And in the mystical, Makuta is the dark spirit, whose spell sent Matanui into unending slumber, an enemy of their world's top deity. He has no body, is merely pure energy tied to armor, a malicious force personified. He seeks to corrupt the Matoran, to worship him, and abandon all their morals that the Great Spirit gave to them. Exposure to him causes people to become corrupted and evil, and bend to his very will, and his essence is shown as a virus that possesses his victims. Even several of his powers, like those of the Rakshi, are the spiritual opposites of the very principles the Matoran derived from the three virtues. When looked at from this lens, the complementary and opposing nature of Matanui and Makuta becomes so much more evident, and shows how Makuta is such an appropriate and stunningly written villain for this series, as not only is he a terrifying evil for the heroes to face, but the living antithesis of the core themes of the story. And while Makuta Pterodax's characterization did change in major ways across the story, his fundamental nature as corruption to the core themes stayed the same, providing a thematic through line to his role in the story. Because even as we learn more about Pterodax as a person, as a force in the story, Makuta remains the same. So we can see that it is the combination and interweaving of these themes that creates Bionicle's truly unique atmosphere. This blended aesthetic makes the world so fascinating to think about, and it's one of the things that elevates the story in my mind. Because while it isn't perfect, I've never seen a story combine motifs of this kind in such a rich and mind-blowing way? I've been trying to think of other stories that blend genres and aesthetics like Bionicle does. One notable comparison, I think, would be Star Wars, that also blends sci-fi and fantasy together, and is beautifully and uniquely atmospheric because of it. It has the spaceships and the super advanced technology of the galaxy spanning society, but it also has the magic and mysticism of the Force and the Jedi, which does create a fascinating blended atmosphere that draws people to the world. But one difference between Star Wars and Bionicle is that while Star Wars has them both present and abundant, the themes of futuristic tech and ancient magic aren't intrinsically linked to each other in the way that the themes are in Bionicle. Obviously, Star Wars needs both to truly be Star Wars at heart, but in the story and world building, the two are kind of separate. They don't really rely on or play off of each other, nor is the presence of both used to hint at a greater mystery. Star Wars is a fantasy story in a sci-fi setting, while Bionicle, on the other hand, took the idea and carried it a little further, becoming a story that purposefully blurs the line between sci-fi and magic and biology. And the connections between those elements of the story is in many ways the whole point. Actually, I'm thinking about it, and another story that does this very well would be Dune by Frank Herbert. Dune is this series of books set in a far distant future about the various power struggles for the desert planet of Arrakis over a resource known as spice. The spice essentially fuels the entirety of a spacefaring empire by granting limited precognition needed to navigate starships at light speed. The spice is guarded by the terrifying gigantic sandworms that live in the desert, who produce the spice as a part of their life cycle. Now, I haven't finished the series yet, but from what I've seen so far, Dune also likes playing around with weaving together different themes that are usually considered separate. In fact, in some ways, it does a lot of what Bionicle does. Like Bionicle, Dune intertwines technology and biology, as there are no computers or AI in the story. So much of the technology has actually been replaced by humans, who, through the use of either genetic engineering, overuse of consciousness-expanding substances, or extremely intense forms of physical and psychological training, have achieved various superhuman abilities that let them fill the role that the machines left behind. Dune is also a deeply environmental story, hailed as one of the first true works of climate fiction, well before issues of global warming became prominent in the public consciousness. That environmentalism weaves itself in through the ways the book explores themes of religion and nature preservation. The Fremen, the people native to the planet, believe the giant sandworms are an extension of God, and the ecosystem the worms create with their activity is sacred. The various forces that come to the planet for control are all imperial colonialist invaders who do not care for how their activities impact the planet and its people, only how the resource can be used to fuel their wealth and power. Much of the plot revolves around the fulfillment of a spiritual prophecy of a figure who will unite and lead them to take their land back. So we see that Dune actually forms a great comparison, as just like Bionicle, the themes of technology, biology, mysticism, and nature all come together, and their intertwinement is a necessary component of the plot and world building. Going back to Bionicle, what made it so unique and eye-catching is how these disparate core themes embedded themselves in nearly every aspect of the story and world building, and yet the reasons why were kept hidden from the audience for most of the story. The simple act of them being combined like this raised deep philosophical questions just from the paradox of things that are normally depicted as incompatible, flawlessly meshing together. This video has been one of my favorites to write, as it really crystallizes in my mind what made the story so interesting and deep to me, beyond just the plot and characters, which were also fantastic. Thanks so much for sticking through and listening to me wax poetic about some of my philosophical ideas about the story. But what do you guys think? Are these the core motifs of Bionicle's world building that made it atmospheric to you? Or were there other elements that made it fascinating? What do you think about Bionicle's atmosphere and how well it played with various tropes? And what are some other stories you enjoy that achieve a unique atmosphere by blending various different aesthetics? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you guys soon. Take care, my gathered friends.